Hey Bible lovers, I'm Tim Nichols and I'm here to bring you your Nichols Worth, and today we're going to talk about some things you should consider before you choose an English translation of the Bible. So let's just take a quick walk through as to how different translations work and their textual sources, and then we'll take it from there. But first we have what is called an interlinear Bible. Now what an interlinear Bible is it takes the text and it puts it interlinear with the Hebrew or the Greek. The word order follows the original language. For example, in Hebrew it will go right to left, but in the Greek it will go left to right, just like it does in English. But this is going to be very difficult to read, but it's going to be very literal and very accurate. Word for word, literal, all the way down, regardless of if it makes sense in English. The goal here is not for it to make sense in English, but for it to be word for word. Often, like this one, they are accompanied with a more literal type translation on the side. This is put out by Hendrickson. This is a 5-volume set, but they also have a single volume that's really large. So that's one option. Another thing you want to consider is, do I want to go a little more word for word, but do I want to be able to understand it in English? And there are some options there as well. We start off with the King James. Now this is in a more of an archaic English, and it's going to be a little more difficult for a modern reader to read, but this is a word-for-word translation. And one thing I like about word-for-word translations is they offer supplied words in order to make it make a little more sense. And when they do that, they put them in italics. You can see that in the King James, the New King James, and you can also see that in the NASB. For example, the word had there is not in the original Hebrew. That word is supplied. So that's really honest translation, and that's something that I like. Now, if you don't mind supplied words just being kind of rolled in with the text, then a good option is the ESV. The ESV does not italicize the supplied words. They just put them in the regular text. I personally prefer those words to be italicized. I want to know what was in the original, and I want to know what was not. So that's one thing to consider, is do you want something a little more interlinear to where you have to struggle to read it, but at least you know you're getting every word right? Do you want something translated into English that has some supplied words that help it make sense? Or do you want something a little more on the understandable scale? And then when you get to that, we are looking at like the NIV or the CSB, and the CSB is called an optimal equivalent, and what this does is it translates it word for word when it makes sense in the English, but when it doesn't, it uses more of a thought for thought or dynamic equivalent approach, where the NIV always uses the more dynamic approach. Now, what is a dynamic approach? A dynamic approach is taking a complete thought and translating it rather than translating word for word. So they kind of take in whole phrases and translate them in ways that make sense. And also you could go for a more ecumenical translation, one that is designed to go cross-denominationally or across the lines of Orthodox, Catholic, Presbyterian, High Church, regular church. It doesn't matter. And the NRSV is designed to do that. Now the NRSV does have some problems. I'm going to put a video on my thoughts on the NRSV, especially the NRSV updated edition, on the end screen, just so you can check that out. But if you're wanting something a little more ecumenical that's translated with potentially a little less theological bias, like your ESV, some people have accused it of, this is a good option. And then after you consider, do you want word for word? Do you want something a little more on the dynamic equivalent, thought for thought side? You also consider, do I want something that's very understandable and I'm willing to sacrifice accuracy for understandability? Then you're going to go to something like the NLT, and there's even like the Message and some other Bibles that are actually paraphrases. Now the NLT is not a paraphrase. It is a translation, but it is definitely translated for a modern reader, for a 8th grade and below reading level. This thing is designed to be able to be read. So this is a good translation. This is a solid translation. It's not a paraphrase. But if you put over here the word for word scale and you put over here the paraphrase scale, this is going to be right at the end of the translation scope. So this is something I'd recommend for someone who's just learning to read the Bible that wants to be able to understand it a little more easily. Another thing to consider is your textual source. What textual source do I want my scripture to be translated from? And there's actually more textual sources than you may think. First of all, there is the Latin Vulgate. Now, if you want the Latin Vulgate that I know of, I'm sure there are probably some others, but that I know of, the only option is the Douay Rheims and the Knox translation. And those are both available from Baronius Press. Also, Loretto produces this one, which is the Haydock Douay Rheims. And they also have some regular douay rheims without the commentary and pictures and things like that. This is something I highly recommend. I think every Christian should eventually read something from the Latin sources. Another source for scripture that a lot of people tend to overlook is the Septuagint. Now, there are two options for the Septuagint in English that I'm aware of. I'm sure there are more, and that is the Brenton. This is in a little bit of an older English. It's a little more difficult to understand, but there's now the Lexham English Septuagint, which is designed to be more understood by the English reader. I highly recommend that everyone read from the Septuagint as well, because it's got some interesting differences. For example, the height of Goliath is different in the Septuagint than it is in some of your other text sources. Another textual source to consider is the Textus Receptus. This was put together in the 1500s by Erasmus, and it is believed to be the original scriptures faithfully handed down through the centuries, and there are many translations that you can get with that. Unfortunately, there are none that are in the thought for thought category. The MEV is probably the closest to that point, but it's really kind of not in print. It's been a translation that seems to have died. There's been talks of updates, but we haven't seen anything materialize yet. But if you like the Textus Receptus, then the King James, of course, is a good option. My favorite is the New King James. This is a great choice. These are both literal, word-for-word translations as much as possible with supplied words. Another textual source is called your critical apparatus, which I believe is on its 28th edition right now. Now, the disadvantage of that one is it tends to be updated, and that means that your translation has to be updated as well. But there's the CSB, the NLT that I just pointed out, the NRSV, the NIV, the ESV, even the NASB. Now, one thing I like about the NASB is it's one of the few that uses the critical apparatus and actually gives you the supplied words like I showed you earlier. Now, one more textual source that we don't hear talked about a lot is the majority text. Now, I actually have a majority text Bible off for rebind. It is the NJV. I also know there's the WEB, and also the Berean Standard Bible actually has a majority text translation, but it is not in print. So there are those options. I'm sure there's more, and if you're aware of more, let me know, because I would love to explore those options. When you're choosing an English translation, there are things to consider. Number one, what is the textual source that you want it to be from? Do you want it from the Latin? Are you a Catholic, or are you Orthodox and maybe you prefer the Byzantine text, also known as the majority text? Are you someone that wants it to be a little more readable? Then you're probably going to go for the critical apparatus. If you're someone that prefers something a little more word for word, your Textus Receptus is generally going to have translations in that family, although we do have the ESV and the NASB that do that same thing using the critical apparatus as well. And then, of course, you can consider an interlinear Bible, which is going to be word for word all the way down. Understandability is not a factor. There's all kinds of things you should consider when picking a translation for yourself. The most important thing is pick one that you will read and that you will enjoy. Don't let anyone condemn you for whatever textual source you choose, and don't let anyone condemn you for picking a Bible that you can understand. If you can't understand King James English, it is perfectly okay to go down to a CSB or even an NLT or something like that. Anyhow, God bless you. Keep calm. Jesus on. This is your Nicholsworth.